Okay, welcome everybody. We're gonna have a very fun talk focused on cloud security, threat detection, and some encounters of security capabilities with cloud. In fact, when you walk down the expo floor, you sometimes see the fact that certain security capabilities are built clearly by security people for security people. But others are built by cloud people for cloud people. So these divisions still exist. If you see a typical large company operation, not that there's such a thing, you do see organizations that are very clearly derive their lineage from before the cloud era. Sometimes in my daily job, I kind of make slight jokes about how certain people use cloud as if it's a data center. We have this very passionate view that cloud is not just somebody else's computer. So the point of this is that a lot of interesting things happen when the traditional security thinking encounters the novel thinking in the cloud. A lot of things happen, some things break, some things behave differently. Today specifically, we would focus on things that are about that. And this is both of us. I'm Anton Chuvakin. I work for Office of the CISO at Google Cloud. I deal with a lot of challenges dealing with helping clients, doing some research focused on various cloud security topics, and many other things.
And I'm John Stoner. I'm a principal security strategist, part of our security adoption engineering team. So we focus on SecOps, SIM, SOAR, some of the Mandiant solutions as well, pulling these things together for Security Operations Center. I maintain a blog called New to Chronicle that you can check out on the chronicle.security website. So if you haven't checked that out and you're looking to get deeper into Chronicle, I'd highly recommend that.
Perfect. Let's get to the fun stuff. As I started in our introduction, in many cases, detection and response, that's what DNR here stands for, built by a traditional company from before cloud, encounters cloud, and it produces a fair number of interesting things. And I'll guide some of you to those things. Now, I'm assuming, this being Google Cloud Next, some of the audience would be quote unquote experienced in the cloud native, cloud born, cloud focused, and maybe the other half is kind of more cloud curious or a recent tourists or recent entrants to the cloud. That's perfectly okay. They will be very useful things for both types, because ultimately we are talking about how some of the security models, frameworks, approaches, and tools, of course tools as well, that evolved to solve security problems encounter cloud. So, as I said, the motivation specifically focused on security operation tooling, the detection and response tooling. These are the questions I was asking myself when I was thinking about it. When I guide clients that have a robust detection and response capability, robust but born before the arrival of the cloud, before this customer or this organization encountering cloud, these teams have built things that work well, but cloud does break some of those things. Some things break, some goals change, some things that they rely on actually would still work. So to me, this is kind of how my mind was aimed at the problem. I was thinking about how do I plan for it, how do I teach, what do I teach the teams, what should they stop doing, what should they start doing, do they need to change the tools, do they need to change the practices, how else cloud changes the craft of detection and response. And this is, there would be some answers, I think it's an ongoing journey, so some of the answers would be more of a transition state answers. And many security operation teams, or actually security teams in general, when they show up in the cloud, they encounter, of course, the concept of shared responsibility. Now, when somebody who never saw cloud in any way reads about shared responsibility, kind of in a theoretical manner, they see examples that are very crisp. I am the cloud provider, I build the data centers, I deal with hardware, physical security. You're the client, you wrote this application, you brought it to the cloud, you're responsible for security. Sure, that's very easy if you're reading a book or a blog. If you are in real life, it is really not. Because there are many areas, and detection and response specifically is an area where a lot more is very fuzzy. A lot more is about, I'm the cloud provider, I have the tooling, he's a partner, he monitors the tooling for alerts. And this other party is helping me refine the tools. And cloud provider has its own tooling that sort of interacts with this in some unpredictable ways. So shared responsibility, while a very crisp concept in theory, in practice, especially around the SOC and detection and response, becomes very fuzzy. It becomes fuzzy And in many cases, shared responsibility that is assumed to be a clean division of labor doesn't really work. So Google, of course, practices the approach called shared fate, where we play more to help the client on their side. But even with shared fate, there is still a lot of areas where working together is a must. And I think some of the materials, some of the ideas we'll share today would be about working together, especially between cloud teams and detection and response teams. But the point is that if somebody tells you shared responsibility is easy, walk away. It's really not. While the visuals can be made, this is blue, this is green, there are a lot of blue-green areas, and there are many more blue-green areas in detection and response specifically. Now, when we say detection and response, there's a question of, well, wait a second, what are we detecting? And this is where Mandiant team presentation at the same event at Cloud Next highlights some of the ideas for what threats they encounter when they investigate. What type of threat actors, what do they do, what do they want? We do want to build an overall framework for thinking about it because there's a very common debate about this. Are these the same threats? If I had my security operations center or my detection and response team built in the 2000s, 2010s, before cloud, do I watch for the same things? Do I look for the same type of activities? Are the threat actors the same? Are the bad guys the same? And these are good questions, and many of them have to come up when usage of the cloud grows. The interesting bit here is that while cloud itself, the public cloud computing was born, at this point between 1 decade and 2 decades ago, many years ago, there would be companies, organizations that are very new to cloud. Some of them are in this room. Some of people encounter cloud for the first time in 2023. And we don't want them to repeat the mistakes that the original batch of people using cloud have done. So cloud usage grows, incidents grow, and in that sense, we do see some of the classic incidents. We do see some of the novel incidents. We'll show you some data in a moment. But ultimately, this type of thinking is necessary before you start thinking, how am I adjusting what I do for security operations, for detection and response, for the cloud environment, whether it's multi-cloud, one cloud, some IaaS, a lot of SaaS, a lot of other things. So there are industry reports that highlight cloud threats and have lists of like top 11, top 12, top whatever other number. It is actually a lot trickier. And this was kind of my obsession for much of the previous year, where I tried asking various people and conduct research focused on what cloud threats people should focus on. And of course, there's solid data, but there are also organizations that mostly assume that what they need to watch for in the cloud is largely the same to what they detected, what they responded to in the pre-cloud era. And there's a group of people who say, no, it's completely the opposite, everything is new. So if you do talk to these two camps, especially during the same conference, you start to get this, buzz in your head, like, I'm confused, what does it all mean? And what the solid lesson from this would be, and it will be a highlight at the end, of course, is that threats that affect your cloud environment very strongly correlate to your cloud usage. It sounds like a bit of a no-brainer, but it really affects things in a dramatic manner. It's a first-order effect. So if I am a classic lift and shifter who really did copy my data center to the cloud, whether it's a good idea, whether I'm being judgmental here, leave it aside. The point is that you did it. Now, your threats, in many cases, are, in fact, very similar. Sure, you can highlight some more exotic types of insiders or whatnot, but ultimately your threat landscape wouldn't change if your IT and your usage doesn't change. There would be slight tweaks, but admittedly cross-tenant threats would not be high on the list. It would be you forgetting the password or forgetting to configure something and then attackers exploiting this. So in that sense, similarities would dominate. But if I am a startup in the Bay Area that started in the cloud, that never saw the inside of a data center, that can't spell mainframe, your cloud threats would likely be different. And your analysis of what to watch for would also be different. Now, what about some hard data? So Google, of course, runs a cloud, as you've heard. This is Google Cloud Next conference. And so we observe what gets broken into, what gets compromised, what people attack. We have this amazing series of reports called Threat Horizons. This is from number 7. And if you look at this particular pie chart, you see this big red slice. And here we say weak or no password, but it's really more like broad challenges with authentication, IAM. If I broaden it from weak or no password to other authentication problems, or possibly even other permissions problems, it would grow. So this means, in many cases, what gets you in the cloud is not some kind of an exotic 0-day in the virtualization layer. What gets you is no password. And I don't want to psychoanalyze people who do this, but in some cases, they copy what they thought was true for a data center into the cloud. And the result is that they don't actually realize that the world around them changed. And the fact that they had this database server behind 5 firewalls deep inside the company, this is now a SQL instance somewhere in the cloud. So this visual, based on what we observe in terms of cloud compromise, indicates that what gets you very often, in terms of popularity, is the old stuff, not the new stuff. It's the not adjusting to the new realities of the cloud rather than exotic cloud threats. And this is a good lesson, and that's a very useful lesson if you run a SOC or detection and response team, because you'd be watching for things that you kind of had to watch for in the past, but maybe you did less. Do read threat horizons, and actually do read maybe a few recent ones, because you will have a much cleaner view of what actually going on in the massive cloud environments. When we do talk about similarities and differences, what I want to go to next is kind of how to put this knowledge to something practically useful. Now, when I try to apply my traditional detection response thinking in the cloud, I do encounter challenges. One challenge is, of course, the fact that my people, my team, probably isn't as cloud aware. And I used to joke and used to sound like a broken record a little bit, how that they do need to pick up on cloud technologies and specifically on IAM. And this is, I may not like IAM, I may not think IAM is fun, but IAM is hugely central. I've seen a IAM presentation that my colleagues given yesterday was pretty crowded. So I think that many of you are getting the message that IAM would ultimately get you if you don't get IAM in the cloud. But the reskilling, or rather upgrading the skills, is kind of one of the central elements. Kind of sounds a little vague, but it's also very practical, because I've met people who are looking for IP addresses, for server names, and for things that may not make sense in the serverless environments and whatnot. So these things are hard to lay off to the side for some people. A lot of the incidents, a lot of attacks, a lot of detections, as you'd learn further in the presentation, would have a joint nature. Now, some of you know that I used to work for Gartner, and Gartner had this line that a large percentage, let's say 99% of cloud incidents, are customers' fault. It's a line that gets copied from research piece to research piece, and it's kind of true, but it's also not the very pleasant truth. In that sense, the joint nature of attacks, joint nature of response, joint nature of detection is quite central. And this is to what we are trying to change with shared fate, for example. Finally, you do look at the data, and John would cover some of the things, how we do it and what type of data for detection. And on a very high level, if you go look at a 30,000-foot view, sure, you have logs, sure, you have other stuff, but there are changes that are quite central to doing detection and response. And your SOC, your detection and response team, your security team in general, we're going to have to pick on some of that, and we'll show you how. Now, how are these things changing? What happens if you don't change? And this is from my fairly old blog that I've written 2 years ago, SOC Meet Clouds, you won't believe what happened next. And this is sort of a laundry list or a shotgun, sort of a scattershot of issues that people encountered if they try to not change and basically assume cloud is the data center and we'll just get the logs from systems, shove them into our SIEM, on-premise probably, and then just hope for the best. A lot of things just don't work, or they work so badly that you almost start debating whether they're worth doing. And I've seen people not understand a lot of concepts like, what do you mean resource name? I mean, I never had resource names in my 1990s data center, as we say here, in kind of legacy land. A lot of the things just didn't have equivalence. Even the similarities and differences inside identity management were all quite befuddling. So, and ultimately, some of the security vendors haven't evolved, and some of the security vendors, as a result, got left behind because they never really grew to work well with cloud customers. So to me, these are, fun to discuss, but ultimately, what are we doing practically that can help us do a robust detection and response in the cloud for a team that wasn't born in the cloud?
All right, so let's talk about a couple of tools and practices that we can be thinking about in this cloud space itself. First question we probably want to ask is, do our detection and response tools work in that space? And the answer, of course, is it depends, right? If you're in that infrastructure paradigm, and this is the tricky part because you kind of float back across all three of these depending as to which tooling you're using across the board, right? If I'm just taking my machines in my on-premise environment or even virtual machines in my on-premise environment and moving those into a cloud, those EDR systems that I've got out there might work just fine, right? You get the good enough, the checkbox, right?
I think we went overboard with acronyms. Endpoint detection and response, network detection and response, cloud access security broker, and of course SIEM is everybody's favorite. I'm not expanding this one.
We'll get to that one, yeah. But the idea here is that I could go ahead and do something like that. With network detection and response, right? I might have to do some packet mirroring. Might have to do a little bit of configuration, right? That might be a little bit of a reach because it's not quite like a tap that I might be used to. But I can also set up a Zeek, a Core Light, or what have you, and be able to sniff those packets in that IaaS environment and be able to do that kind of traditional NDR. From a log and SIM perspective, obviously, whatever logs and telemetry coming off of those systems and the cloud audit, we can go ahead and grab those kinds of things. CASB probably not as much of a fit in that space. But then when we move into the platform, right, platform as a service, things like, let's say a BigQuery or any kind of database as a service or storage, right, storage buckets, right, then all of a sudden those EDRs kind of fly out the window, right? You don't have an endpoint per se to be able to put a shim on and to be able to look at detections. Maybe in the network space, there's a little bit more you can do, but it's a little bit more constrained. CASB, there might be a little bit more with application calls that you can work with. Maybe yes, maybe no, it's gonna probably depend. But again, the logs in the SIM space, they're still available, right? They just might be a little bit different than what you're used to. Then we get to software as a service, right? So software as a service, whether that's something like an Okta or a Salesforce, right? Or something that another commercial provider, right? At that point, there's no EDR, right? There's no NDR, it's whatever they're gonna give you, right? And that's kind of when you fall back on the CASB to be able to go ahead and say, okay, what are these calls looking like back and forth? But of course, with the Salesforce, with an Okta, with any of these other things, there is log telemetry coming off of those that I can go ahead and pull into my SIM and do something with. All right. Got the wrong direction, I knew I was gonna do that. All right, so what's some of the good news that we've got out there? Well, being able to do some of these things in the cloud makes this a good bit easier to do from a SIM perspective in a scalable manner. And when you say, why is that? I'm gonna go ahead and go back to this gentleman on the left's commentary that he wrote in 2012. So we're going back through the sands of time and talking about some of the SIM challenges. And a couple of things he called out at that point in time were the trifecta of complexity: deployment, administration, and operation. And we talk about operation, we're talking about tool operation. And I kind of think back to my time between 2012 and today when I had a SIM that had a Java virtual machine that if I put more than 10,000 events per second to it, it might fall over, right? That's a problem. Even 5 years ago in the SIM space, I had to be concerned about what kind of search systems that I had and indexing systems that I had to be able to balance those loads so that I wasn't compromising my indexers and having them stop working or compromising my users by not having places where they could actually do their searches, right? By moving this into the cloud, that solves those kinds of elasticity problems and allows us to go ahead and ingest large volumes of data from lots of different spaces. Being able to have those APIs provided outward, right, makes it a little bit easier to go ahead and do things with SOAR, whether there's automation and playbooks, because there are not much richer APIs available to you to hook onto, so you're not getting into having to scrape that data to be able to get at it. Similarly, from a defensive perspective, when you start looking at the workloads themselves, there's a concept called VMTD. I'm not sure how many folks are familiar with that, virtual machine threat detection. Within Security Command Center, we're actually looking at that from basically the hypervisor layer, right below the instance that you've got spun up to be able to detect things like crypto mining, okay? And the benefit of that is that, you know, yes, we said you could go ahead and put an EDR on your system.
The benefit is magical, really.
Yeah, because we take care of it for you.
Some threats magically disappear and they can't run, can't work. And so to me, this is kind of the example where cloud is a really strong advantage. The benefits, certain things, certain bad things can't work.
And then the last part of this is obviously from a security perspective, we can go ahead and do this faster altogether using things like what we call the digital immune system.
And so the last point, I'm kind of alluding to a blog that my boss, the CISO of Google Cloud, has written. So Phil Venables wrote this blog called 8 Megatrends. And the point of this blog, and it's very much required reading for pretty much everybody, is that cloud is, as a system, not just more secure than most/all data centers at this point, but it's actually getting better over time. And this to me is the big piece of good news that the traditional 1990s or 2000s detection and response teams are not used to. They're not used to organizations' infrastructure security improving around them by magic. And to me, this is something that hugely matters, and it's something that cloud natives take for granted, but people who came through the ranks on data center and traditional security are having trouble accepting that actually things get better around you if you do nothing. Not all things, not in every way, but cloud is becoming more secure over time.
So a couple other things that we're doing in this regard is we're building community detection rules. So out on GitHub, you can go out and find our community rules that we've got out there. We are building those, leveraging some of those concepts within that digital immune system around Tor exit nodes, right? That Google is gathering up and making available, safe browsing data, right? Those kinds of things so that I'm collecting my logs, I have these threat intel sources that are coming from GCP. Let's go ahead and put those things together and alert on those detections. Similarly, we've partnered with Okta, that we did some work that we pulled together some of the capabilities there. So again, a good example of a SaaS provider who has their logs. Some of these are kind of traditional authentication use cases, but some of them also tap into concepts that Okta has, like their FastPass capabilities, where we're able to utilize some of those pieces and be able to go ahead and build detections off of those as well. Another project that's going on out there is the cloud detection use case. The cloud detection use case you can find, again, on GitHub under Security Analytics Project. And there's a number of different ones. We talked about IAM a little bit earlier and the pain points that can come with IAM and need to know that. There's actually detections around IAM, around cloud provisioning activities, around network activity, data usage, and the like. And those are available to you as well to go ahead and deploy within your environment. The third group of detections I want to talk about are what are called curated detections. Now, curated detections actually reside inside of Chronicle. This is something that our Google Cloud Threat Intelligence team, GCTI, is building. The set of detection engineers that build these different rule packs for Chronicle. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in a second when some practical rubber hitting the road here. So let's talk about SecOps for GCP. We've kind of talked a lot of different concepts, a lot of different challenges. Let's kind of put this together as the pieces. We want to be able to ingest all security relevant data, right? From the cloud, from on-prem, maybe from other clouds, SaaS providers, what have you. Pull those pieces together and be able to search on those, to be able to hunt on those, to be able to run detections on those, going back as far back as 12 months, right? By default. And so that's what we built this around, is being able to have that scalable capability to ingest all of those logs, but also have a performance search to go back and look for the badness inside of them.
And not just performant, almost instant in many cases. This is kind of people who used to sit in traditional security operations centers are probably thinking that a search that takes 5 minutes is quick, but no. You lived in those environments quite a bit, right? You would think a search that takes 5 minutes is quick, right?
You go get a cup of coffee and come on back and hope you get something back.
But in this case, we are talking about like the Google speed search, right? Hey, it is Google, so Google speed search is kind of reasonable, right? For many cases, this is the change, and the change is quite dramatic for many teams.
The next thing that we want to be able to do here is be able to identify cloud threats. So we talked a little bit about Security Command Center. Security Command Center is focused on GCP and the environment, and it has a combination of both threat detection inside of it. So remember we talked about the virtual machine threat detections, right? Looking at that down low, lower in the hypervisor around the different images, but also looking for things like misconfigurations. If you go back to that earlier slide, I'm not going to flip back to it, so if you have a photo of it, you can skip back to it, or you just remember in your brain, there was what, 54%, something like that? It was like more than half of those things in that report talked about IAM and passwords being part of the problem around those cloud threats. I think another 19% was misconfigurations. These are the kinds of things that the Security Command Center pieces can help bubble up and push forward, and then from there we can obviously ingest them into Chronicle and triage them and do other things with it from there. Which brings us to the detection. Talked about community detections, community rules. We talked about curated detections, being able to write YARA-L. For you're not familiar with YARA-L, YARA-L is an offshoot of YARA, which is what VirusTotal uses to build their signatures that we've adapted for Chronicle. But to be able to go ahead and drive detections using these different rules out there to be able to look and identify for these cloud threats, not crowd threats. Once you have those threats detected, you want to alert on them. Those alerts need to be able to visualize, right? So rather than going ahead and just saying, well, here's a detection and here's a bunch of events, have a nice day, we've started building visualizations to make it easier for an analyst to look at this and say, here's an alert. Here are the entities that are associated with it. When we talk about entities, we're talking about users, we're talking about assets, we're talking about resources. You'll see that more here in a second. But when you think about resources, think like BigQuery tables. Think about data buckets, right? Things that aren't necessarily the classic server, right, and user out there, right? It's that in-between kind of thing. And then from there, once we have those alerts, we don't necessarily want to have to play whack-a-mole, right, with each individual alert. We want to go ahead and bundle those up, be able to look at this more from a case or a threat view, and be able to look at them from that perspective, be able to drill down into it, understand what those different pieces are, and then finally automate that response so that we don't have to sit there and have the analysts keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, right? We want to reduce that toil. We want to have them move forward into the things that we really need them to learn, like learning the cloud environment as a whole.
Notice that he didn't say AI a single time. That's a huge achievement. And I think at this conference specifically, it's like it deserves an applause. Oh, there will be AI in a moment, so don't yeah, but,
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and give you kind of a for instance here. We're going to go through this. We are not doing this as a live demo because I am not going to tempt those fates. But what we're going to look at here is we're going to have an attacker. They're going to gain some access to a publicly exposed service account key. That service account key happens to have BigQuery and Cloud SQL privileges associated with it, or permissions. For the sake of time and not going through everything over and over again, we're going to kind of focus on the BigQuery portion of this. But I'm going to kind of walk you through where this looks like and how these different pieces that I just talked about all come together. All right. All right. So the first thing we're going to talk about is getting our data in. So getting data into Chronicle now is very, very straightforward from GCP. Chronicle actually has its own spot in the Cloud Console. You have an integration that's set up. Once that is set up, within it, there is the concept of what's called direct ingestion. So no forwarders, no shims or anything that have to be put into place. Direct ingestion allows us to go ahead and a toggle switch, turn on cloud logging for GCP, asset metadata, and security command center findings. And you can see literally it's clicking from enabled to disabled for those three different data sets and saving it. At that point, those different data sets start coming in and populating within Chronicle itself. Okay? Once I have my data coming in, now I want to start looking at detections. And so we've got a number of different curated detections out there. There's a number of rule packs that we've built around this, and we continue to go ahead and enhance and modify these. Hopefully it shows up okay. And so as an example, I could go into each one of these different rule packs and go ahead and click on specific rules or packages of rules, and then go ahead and turn on what kind of alerting detection I want to have. So this is an exfiltration alert. There is two different settings, precise and broad. Precise would be more something that you would turn on in a SecOps environment. Broad might be more of a hunting kind of detection. And then the alerting piece is separate from the detection. So you might want to turn your detections on, run it for a little while, see what you get before you start queuing it up for your analysts. We also go ahead and show active rules and those kinds of things. Once that's created, then we have the pieces coming together. We have an alert queue. We can go ahead and filter that down to specific alerts that we care about. We can go ahead and, in this case, we're going to go ahead and look at this over the past 24 hours. We can go ahead and filter this further down to just specific rules. So we're going to look at, in this case, around an exfiltration rule that we care about, which is basically a set of related occurrences. We notice we have a specific IAM, a specific user that's referenced in this rule, and then we get to this point here. I'm going to pause it here because I knew it was going to happen. There we go. Okay. Quick save. All right. So at this point, this that you see in highlight is the alert itself, right? That's a singular alert. Okay. Next to that, those other little triangles are other alerts. So this is what we call the alert graph. rather than watching me go ahead and say, here's an alert, and let's go ahead and explore and see a bunch of other things pop out. That looks really kind of cool, but it really gets a little bit like, okay, here's 5 other alerts, here's 20 other alerts, right? So I'm gonna kind of staged it here for you so you can kind of see what this would look like as you're walking through it. But what we have here is we have a specific user over on the lower left-hand side of the screen there who is the impacted user. Okay, we've got an IP address associated with this. We have a couple of tables on the right-hand side of the screen that are BigQuery tables. One's called keys customers, and the other's called customers. So these are BigQuery tables. We're running DLP on these, so this is going ahead and taking DLP data, BigQuery data, and running this through SCC to go ahead and detect these. On the left-hand side of the screen, we've got these little cards that talk about the alerts and then the entities that are associated with it. So as I'm looking at this, and I'm trying to understand what I've got here, I've got these cards that describe this at the high level. I've got the entities that I can visualize, but I still have my events down at the bottom of the screen. So I still want to get down to the raw events. I can go ahead and drill into the raw events and be able to see that information here. Are there more resources or more entities that I want to go ahead and associate with this? I have them down at the bottom of the page, and I can go ahead and add them into my view. So I can go ahead and maybe put those in there to go ahead and trace from one thing to the next. Finally, we also have alert context. So the context is some of the pieces that our GCTI team are building from a curated detections to provide that additional context from the raw logs that you can go ahead and see. And so in this set of rules, we could see that we have got the affected tables, we've got associated alerts, we've got risk scores, and we've got some associated API calls all right there in the view that I don't have to go digging for any of that information. Now, if I pivot to another one, right, because maybe I've got this specific user and I'm concerned about it, I can pivot to a BigQuery exfiltration with DLP context. And in this case, again, I got alert context that talks about the customers table being impacted. It was copied off to an attacker-controlled table called patients. There is DLP info types around credit card numbers, date of birth, email addresses, social security numbers, all in one table. It's a good place to put all your data in one table, right? Anyhow, but I can go ahead and see that kind of information because, again, I'm pulling those DLP pieces in with those tables themselves. I'm going to go ahead and pivot to a third, right? Because the same IP address has these 3 alerts associated with it. In this case, the keys customers table, we're seeing this alert firing off because we saw this table exported out to a storage bucket, right? A CSV in a storage bucket. And again, with the DLP, we're saying, hey, there's keys in this storage bucket that were exported or exfiltrated, and email addresses as well. So we're getting that bigger picture here. Finally, as we look at the other alert that's associated with this specific user, we see this 4th event, which is called persistence anomalous grant. And so what does that mean? Basically what happened here was that this specific user went ahead and provided a key to this user called analytics workload, gave them the editor role, and that role spun up a workload called 12345 in the central 1A region. Right, so fraud, waste, and abuse kinds of use case at that point, right? Somebody's spinning something up, maybe gonna do a crypto miner, maybe gonna do some other stuff with it. But I can take all of those things in that alert and feed that over into a case view where I have, in this case, there's actually even more alerts that are associated with this. There's about 15 different alerts, but they're all bundled up into a case. They're all grouped together based on time and that user and say, hey, these are all part of this overall larger threat. And so I can view this from a case perspective in this view, but I can also go ahead and drill into each one of those alerts, and I can run playbooks on each of those alerts to go ahead and do something. So let's look at the anomalous grant one that we've got. In that anomalous grant alert, which we'll see here in a second, all right, we can go ahead and see that we've got a playbook that ran against it. We can see that we've got an alert associated with that, which I could drill back into the SIM and look at all of the detections that happened with that, right? So I go back to that raw data. But as I scroll down here, I can also see what are some of the other entities that are part of this. I can see that we've got, in this case, 435. If I just scroll down a little bit farther. Scroll, there we go. 435 associated as similar alerts. So maybe if this has been happening an awful lot, I maybe want to do something else about this rather than have it happen all the time. I can see enrichments for MITRE ATT&CK, again, from the playbooks running in the background. And even if I had something like a VirusTotal shim, I could take my IP addresses, look, I don't have anything in VirusTotal there, but maybe if I had file hashes for a different use case, I would get that. Now on the bottom right-hand side of the screen here, we've got a remediation summary. So this is actually something where we ran that playbook, and it turns out that we've already remediated this specific issue, right? We went ahead and terminated that workload 12345, and we disabled that account that we had that editor role access to. And how do I know that aside from it telling me that? I could also click on the playbook itself and see the playbook history. So the playbook here is kind of a nice kind of rundown here. You hit a fork in the road and then you do this or that, right? When I click on the if, then, or that, basically what I could see is that I got to this point in my playbook, and because I had the information around the email address that I needed to go ahead and terminate, I could go ahead and take action there. If I didn't have that, I might have to generate an email to send it to somebody and say, hey, can you go find this thing and take care of it? But because I have those different pieces, I can go ahead and streamline that effort. I probably want to work on the root cause of that, but I don't have to sit there and spend my time finding that system, turning it off, finding that those keys, terminating that user, and those sorts of things. I can move on with my day. All right. So we're about at the end of our time. Where we want to go ahead and kind of leave you with is a couple of takeaways. And then after that, I think we're going to open it up to questions. And I think there's a mic here in the front if there are questions. But there's a couple of things that we want to go ahead and think about as we go through and hopefully coming out of this. So do you want to go ahead and start?
Sure. I would say that the first line, or first takeaway here is not just me trying to be funny, but I think that when people quote about cloud mistakes, configuration mistakes, identity mistakes, and then they say cloud is challenging. We do say that cloud is challenging if you don't understand it, and that becomes a very obvious statement. Ultimately, many of the pre-cloud security teams probably need to invest a lot more resources into learning cloud. Sure, we can make things easy, we can provide guidance, consulting, advisory, that's what I do some of my time, but it would be hard until people's minds change the fact that cloud is different enough. It's not just somebody else's computer. Take the time to learn the cloud if you're focusing on one area, and if you're sort of a relatively new cloud entrant, it will be IAM because, again, threat indicators show that the likely IAM mistake is what gets you. Now, agonizing over threats is maybe a fun thing for me to do, but for many clients, threats would closely correlate to the type of usage. If you are arriving with your on-premise ideas, technologies, practices, likely your threats would be very similar to what you had. If you are starting in the cloud, you would have a fairly significant difference in how threats look. So to me, this is kind of the assess your own cloud threats is the answer, and there are many threat assessment methodologies, way to model what's going on, your systems, and then you go to use cases, as John pointed out. But the use cases libraries would have to be tweaked and kind of colored, so to say, by what type of threats you face. To me, it's not enough to say, hey, Anton and John, give me the list of threat detection rules and I'll run them. Sure, we can, and we do. But in many cases, the value comes from you understanding the threats and then tuning this to what you face. Finally, we did say that a lot of cloud natives and cloud-focused companies take automation for granted, but a lot of security teams that landed from on-premise do not. And automation is a hard journey for them, and even understanding that IT and business around them have automated a lot of things, but they have not, is the daily reality. So tools like SOAR, Security Orchestration, Automation, Response, again, another acronym from my former colleagues, is a pathway to automation for many SOCs, and this to me is improved quite a bit when SOAR is cloud native, cloud born, connects to cloud. So to me, this is very clear that automation for a security team would not just be learning how IT automates. That's a big bucket of it. But the other bucket is, of course, using either the same tools or SOAR tools to do things.
Yeah, and so then when we talk about cloud hygiene, right? A cloud hygiene and posture tremendously helps your detection and response. If I know what I'm defending, I have a much better chance of being able to defend it and build detections towards those things. Being able to ingest the metadata associated with those different cloud entities helps me be able to kind of get a handle on what are the things that I have out there in my projects. Now, does that cover all of the rogue projects that are out there? Maybe not, but at least it gets you started with the stuff that's associated with your environments, right? And that obviously has tie-in from an on-premise world, right? We don't know what we're defending and be able to write detections to defend it. Lean in on that cloud service provider data feeds that are out there. I mentioned things like safe browsing, right, which we have access to go ahead and ingest those file hashes. Tor exit nodes is another data set that we go ahead and lean in on. Even things like virus total, if you're using virus total data, you can ingest that into Chronicle and a number of other data sets. But leverage those data sets to be able to go ahead and say, you know what, there's a community of folks out there that are identifying these things, that are knowing that these things are bad, right? You think of the neighborhood watch kinds of scenarios. That's kind of where this piggybacks. So it's a combination of neighborhood watch plus GCP kind of saying, this is problematic. Let's lean in on those kinds of things, identify them, and detect and remediate from there. And if you don't know where to start, right, there's a lot of things that are out there that you've done in the on-premise environments, as Anton had referenced before. Start with the things that you know. Start with the things you're comfortable with. If you're not comfortable with going ahead and handling storage buckets and BigQuery today, that's okay, right? There's still the virtual machines. There's the IaaS portions of this. Maybe there's the SaaS portions of it that you're more familiar with because of other history that you have. Start with the pieces you know, work on those detections and those use cases, and then build from there.
Perfect. Any questions at this point? We sort of mixed some of the high-level, mid-level, detailed stuff, so hopefully it was useful for enough people. Any reactions, any comments, questions? Well, sounds like it worked out. Thank you.